And so I said, well, who is it? Anybody I know? He said, no, you wouldn't have heard of him. His name is Elvis Presley. Really? I said, I've seen his name on a jukebox in Dallas.
In 1957, Elvis Presley pulled Pat Boone into a quiet hallway and told him something that changed everything. For 70 years, he kept that conversation secret, never telling anyone what Elvis had warned him about. But now, at 90 years old, Pat Boone has finally decided to speak. What did Elvis see coming that scared Boone so much? The confession that stopped time. At 8 a.m. on March 28, 2026, a single sentence from Pat Boone's representative sent a quiet shockwave through the entertainment world. At 90, Pat Boone decided to share what Elvis tried to warn him about in 1957. No preamble, no context, just a statement that landed with the weight of 7 decades pressing down on it. The announcement arrived not with fanfare, but with the kind of deliberate calm that suggested the words behind it had been held back for far too long. Boone, the clean-cut crooner who had stood as Elvis's polar opposite in the golden age of rock and roll, had never spoken publicly about this warning. Not in interviews, not in memoirs, not even to close friends who had spent years asking what really happened between him and Presley during those electric, dangerous years when American music was being torn apart and rebuilt. The timing felt significant. Boone had turned 90 just weeks earlier, and those who knew him understood that milestone birthdays often unlock confessions that younger years kept buried. But this wasn't nostalgia. This was something heavier, something that had waited nearly 70 years to surface. Yet the statement gave no details, offered no clarity, only the haunting implication that Elvis Presley, the king himself, had seen something coming that Boone had either ignored or failed to understand. And now, decades after Elvis's death, decades after the screaming fans and chart battles and cultural warfare had faded into history, Boone was finally ready to speak. What had Elvis warned him about? What danger had the king seen that the golden boy missed? Stay with me, because the story that led to this March morning is far stranger, darker, and more tragic than anyone expected. When two worlds collided. To understand the warning, we have to return to 1957, a year when America was splitting down the middle, and Pat Boone and Elvis Presley stood on opposite sides of the fracture. Boone was the safe choice. Elvis read The Boy Mothers Trusted, the singer who covered Little Richard and Fats Domino, and stripped away the danger until the songs could play on family radio. Elvis was the threat, the hip-swiveling scandal, the voice that made teenagers scream and parents reach for the phone to call their congressman. They should have been enemies. The press certainly framed them that way, pitting Boone's white buck shoes against Elvis's sneer, wholesomeness against rebellion, the past against the future. But behind the scenes, in the strange, pressurized world of late 50s show business, the two men crossed paths more often than the public knew. They shared stages, dressing rooms, and, on a handful of occasions, late-night conversations that no one else was meant to hear. It was during one of those conversations, in a backstage hallway in Memphis, that Elvis first said something that made Boone stop cold. The details of that moment have remained locked away in Boone's memory for nearly 70 years, guarded with a kind of protective silence that only deepens with age. But those who were nearby that night, stagehands and musicians who caught fragments of the exchange, remembered the look on Boone's face when he walked away. He wasn't angry, he wasn't confused. He was shaken, the kind of shaken that doesn't show itself in the moment but settles in over years, quietly reshaping everything that comes after. Elvis, for his part, never mentioned the conversation again, at least not publicly. But friends close to Presley later noted that he seemed troubled whenever Boone's name came up, as if he had tried to pass along something important and wasn't sure it had been received. By the end of 1957, their paths began to diverge. Elvis was drafted, sent to Germany, pulled away from the machinery of fame just as it was consuming him. Boone continued his steady rise, hosting television shows, making movies, building a career defined by safety and control. On the surface, it seemed like Boone had won, that his version of success, clean and sustainable, had outlasted Elvis's dangerous flame. But that surface was deceptive. Beneath it, something Elvis had seen, something he had tried to warn Boone about, was already taking root. And it would take decades before Boone understood what the king had been trying to protect him from. The weight of silence. For nearly 70 years, Pat Boone carried Elvis's warning like a stone in his pocket. That's something he could feel but never quite bring himself to examine. He built a life around it, a career, a family, a public image so carefully managed that the edges never showed. Boone became the opposite of what Elvis represented, the anti-chaos, the man who proved you could survive fame without burning out. He outlasted the scandals, the divorces, the overdoses, the implosions that claimed so many of his generation. He watched from a safe distance as the music industry devoured its own, as the very fame Elvis had warned him about turned into a machinery of destruction. And through it all, Boone stayed quiet. Not because he didn't understand, but because understanding it meant admitting that Elvis had been right. And admitting that meant confronting the cost of the choices he had made in response. The silence became its own kind of weight. Friends noticed it, the way Boone would pause when Elvis's name came up, the way his expression would shift just slightly, as if he were looking at something no one else could see. Interviewers asked, of course. Thus, over the years, dozens of journalists tried to crack open the mystery of what had really existed between Boone and Presley. Two men who represented opposite poles of the same cultural earthquake. Boone deflected gracefully, offering anecdotes about their mutual respect, their shared Southern roots, their brief moments of camaraderie. But he never spoke about the warning. He never even hinted that there had been a conversation in Memphis, a moment when Elvis had looked him in the eye and said something that would echo for the rest of his life. The closer Boone got to 90, Anis, the heavier that silence became. Those who knew him well began to sense a shift in the months leading up to his birthday. Boone started revisiting old interviews, old footage, moments from 1957 that he hadn't watched in decades. He asked his family questions about memory, about what it means to hold on to something for so long that it becomes part of you. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. They understood that something was surfacing, something that had been buried under years of carefully constructed calm. And then, just weeks after turning 90, Boone made the decision. He would finally speak. He would tell the world what Elvis had tried to warn him about. Not because he owed anyone an explanation, but because carrying it alone had become unbearable. The question that remained was simple, brutal, and impossible to avoid. What had Elvis seen that Boone had spent a lifetime trying not to face? The Memphis hallway. The warning came on a night in late August 1957 in a narrow backstage hallway at the Ellis Auditorium in Memphis, a venue that had witnessed everything from gospel revivals to rock and roll riots. Both men were scheduled to appear on the same bill, a rare convergence that promoters had billed as a passing of the torch, though no one could agree on who was passing what to whom. Boone was at the height of his chart dominance, his version of Love Letters in the Sand holding the #1 spot for weeks. Elvis, fresh off his own string of hits, was in that strange transitional moment before the army, still dangerous but already being repackaged, softened, all prepared for a comeback that wouldn't come for years. They had crossed paths before, but always in public, always surrounded by handlers and press and the machinery of fame. This time was different. The hallway was dim, lit only by a single overhead bulb that flickered intermittently, casting shadows that made the space feel smaller than it was. Boone had just finished his set, still wearing the white dinner jacket that had become his signature, when he turned a corner and found Elvis leaning against the wall, smoking a cigarette, alone. It was unusual. Elvis was never alone. There were always people, bodyguards, hangers-on, girls waiting just outside the dressing room door. But tonight, in this hallway, it was just the two of them. Boone nodded, a gesture of professional respect, and moved to pass. Elvis stopped him with a single word. Pat. Not a greeting, not a question, just a name spoken with enough weight that Boone paused. Elvis looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, the cigarette burning down between his fingers. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost too quiet to hear over the muffled sound of the crowd still filtering out of the auditorium. They're gonna try to take everything from you, Elvis said. And the worst part is you'll let them, because you'll think you're supposed to. Boone didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what Elvis meant, wasn't sure if this was exhaustion talking or bitterness or something else entirely. Elvis took a drag from the cigarette, exhaled slowly, and continued. You think if you play it safe, if you do everything right, they'll leave you alone. They won't. They'll just take it slower. Oh, and when you're my age, you'll look back and realize you gave away more than I ever lost." The words hung in the air, heavy and strange, and Boone felt something shift inside him, a recognition he couldn't quite name. He wanted to ask what Elvis meant, wanted to push back, to defend the choices he had made, the career he had built. But before he could speak, someone called Elvis's name from down the hall, and the moment collapsed. Elvis crushed out the cigarette, gave Boone a look that might have been pity or warning or both, and walked away. Boone stood alone in the flickering light, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He wouldn't understand for decades. The unraveling. In the months and years that followed the Memphis hallway, Boone tried to forget what Elvis had said. It wasn't difficult at first. His career was ascending, his family was growing, and the machinery of fame that Elvis had warned him about seemed, from Boone's perspective, entirely manageable. He made movies, hosted television specials, recorded albums that sold millions, and did it all without the chaos that surrounded Presley. He wore the white buck shoes, sang the sanitized covers, and became exactly what America wanted him to be: safe, clean, unthreatening. He believed genuinely that he had found a better path, that his version of success was sustainable in a way Elvis's could never be. But success, Boone would later realize, is a shifting target, and the industry that had built him into a symbol of wholesomeness had no loyalty to symbols once they stopped being useful. By the mid-1960s, the landscape was changing. The Beatles arrived, Dylan went electric, and suddenly the clean-cut crooner with the gospel roots and the family-friendly image felt less like the future and more like a relic. Boone's records stopped charting, his television deals dried up. The roles that had once been offered freely disappeared. He wasn't blacklisted, wasn't scandal-ridden, wasn't destroyed in the dramatic public way that claimed so many of his peers. He was simply, quietly set aside. And in that quiet displacement, Boone began to understand what Elvis had meant. The industry hadn't taken everything from him in one violent seizure. It had done exactly what Elvis predicted. It had taken it slowly, piece by piece, with Boone's own cooperation, until he looked around and realized he had spent decades giving away control in exchange for safety that was never real. Elvis, meanwhile, had returned from Germany, made his comeback, and then slowly, publicly, unraveled. Boone watched from a distance as the king's life became a spectacle. The movies, the Vegas years, the prescription pills, the isolation. He watched and told himself that his path had been the right one, that whatever Elvis had lost, Boone had avoided. But the conviction felt hollow, because while Elvis's destruction had been visible, dramatic, the stuff of headlines, Boone's had been invisible, a slow erosion of autonomy and identity that no one outside his inner circle could see. By the time Elvis passed away in 1977, Boone had spent 2 decades wrestling with the warning, trying to decide if the king had been prophetic or just bitter. The answer, Boone now understands, was both. Elvis had seen what the industry did to people. Yes, how it consumed them, whether they burned bright or faded quietly. And he had tried, in that dim hallway in Memphis, to give Boone a choice. But some warnings can't be heeded until it's too late to matter. The cost of control. What Elvis had warned Boone about wasn't fame itself. It was the bargain fame required, the unspoken contract that demanded you trade pieces of yourself in exchange for success, safety, and the illusion of control. Boone had signed that contract eagerly, believing that if he just played by the rules, if he stayed clean and cooperative and unthreatening, he could have a career without the chaos. And in a sense, he was right. He avoided the overdoses, the public meltdowns, the tabloid scandals that destroyed so many of his generation. But what he didn't avoid, what he couldn't avoid, was the slow and silent surrender of everything that had made him an artist in the first place. The industry took his edge first, smoothing out the rough gospel intensity that had defined his early recordings, replacing it with orchestral arrangements and songs chosen by committees. Then it took his autonomy, dictating which movies he could make, which television shows he could host, which public positions he could take. And finally, it took his relevance, deciding without announcement or explanation that his time had passed and moving on to the next safe, controllable star. Boone cooperated with every step of this process. He told himself he was being professional, strategic, smart. He convinced himself that survival meant compromise, that longevity required flexibility, that the only way to outlast the chaos was to never resist the machinery. And he did outlast it. He survived long enough to see Elvis pass away, to see the industry chew through generations of artists, to watch the whole system collapse and rebuild itself around new technologies and new economics. But survival, Boone realized too late, was not the same as winning. Elvis had burned out at 42, destroyed by the very fame he had revolutionized. Boone had lived to 90, still performing, still working, still present. But somewhere along the way, in all those years of careful compromise, he had lost the thing Elvis had refused to surrender, even at the end. He had lost himself. The realization came gradually, not in a single moment of clarity, but in a series of small recognitions that accumulated over decades. Boone would be on stage, singing one of the sanitized covers that had made him famous. And feel a flicker of something, not quite regret, not quite shame, but a deep, inarticulate sense that he was performing a role rather than expressing a truth. He would watch old footage of Elvis, raw and dangerous and utterly himself, and feel a pang of something close to envy. Not envy of the fame or the chaos, but envy of the refusal to compromise, the insistence on being exactly who he was, even when it destroyed him. Boone had spent his entire career trying to avoid Elvis's fate, and in doing so, had created a different kind of tragedy, quieter, longer, but no less complete. The warning Elvis had given him in that Memphis hallway wasn't a prediction. It was an invitation to make a choice. And Boone, in choosing safety, had chosen a kind of slow-motion disappearance that took 90 years to fully understand. The silence breaks. The decision to finally speak came not from a desire for attention or vindication, but from something simpler and more urgent. The recognition that carrying a secret for 70 years had become unbearable. Boone had spent most of his life protecting Elvis's warning, holding it close, refusing to share it even with those closest to him. He told himself he was being respectful, that the conversation in Memphis had been private, that Elvis deserved to have his words remain between them. But as Boone approached 90, as the years accumulated and the weight of the unspoken became heavier, he began to understand that the silence was protecting no one. Elvis was gone. The industry that had consumed them both had transformed into something neither would recognize. And the warning itself, or bet the insight that had haunted Boone for decades, might actually matter to someone still navigating the same impossible bargains. In the weeks leading up to March 28, 2026, Boone began drafting the statement, working through multiple versions, trying to find language that honored both the warning and the man who had given it. He didn't want sensationalism. He didn't want to reduce Elvis's insight to a headline or a soundbite. He wanted to convey the full weight of what had been said, the context, the cost, the decades of wrestling with its implications. His family, when he told them what he was planning, reacted with a mixture of relief and concern. Relief that he was finally releasing something that had clearly burdened him. Concern that the world might not understand. You asked that the confession might be misinterpreted or sensationalized in ways that would hurt rather than illuminate. Boone listened to their worries, considered them carefully, and proceeded anyway. Some truths, he had decided, mattered more than their reception. The statement was released at 8 a.m., a deliberately chosen time that echoed the precision of the original warning, the sense that some moments demand exact time stamps to signal their significance. Boone's representative read the words carefully, slowly, ensuring that each sentence carried its full weight. At 90, Pat Boone has decided to share what Elvis tried to warn him about in 1957. The warning was simple but profound. Elvis told him that the industry would take everything if you let it, and that playing it safe was just another way of losing yourself slowly. For nearly 70 years, Boone has carried those words, and now he believes it's time to honor them by speaking the truth Elvis saw. That fame is not a prize to be won, but a bargain to be carefully, painfully negotiated, and that sometimes the only way to survive is to refuse the terms entirely. The statement ended there, with no elaboration, no explanation of what Boone planned to do next. Just the warning, finally released into the world, freed from the silence that had held it for so long. what Elvis saw. Elvis's warning to Boone wasn't born from bitterness or rivalry, but from a deep, painful understanding of what the music industry demanded from those it claimed to elevate. By 1957, Elvis had already seen enough to recognize the pattern. The way the machinery of fame identified talent, packaged it, sold it, and then discarded it when the returns diminished. He had watched it happen to the black artists whose music he loved, whose styles he had borrowed, whose innovations had been repackaged for white audiences without credit or compensation. He had felt it happening to himself, the pressure to soften his image, to make movies instead of music, to become a product rather than an artist. And when he looked at Boone, he saw someone walking willingly into the same trap. Someone who believed that cooperation and compliance would somehow protect him from the industry's appetites. Elvis knew better. What Elvis understood, and what he tried to communicate in that brief hallway conversation, was that the industry's cruelty wasn't limited to those who resisted. It consumed everyone, rebels and conformists alike, just through different mechanisms at different speeds. The rebels burned fast and bright, destroyed by their own resistance, turned into cautionary tales about the dangers of excess and authenticity. The conformists burned slow and quiet, eroded piece by piece until nothing remained but the performance of who they used to be. Boone, with his clean image and careful career management, was choosing the second path. And Elvis, who knew he was doomed to the first, wanted Boone to understand what that choice would cost. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, over decades, until Boone woke up one day and realized he had spent his entire life being someone else's version of himself. The tragedy, as Boone now understands, is that Elvis was right, but also powerless. He says the warning couldn't change the fundamental nature of the industry, couldn't alter the impossible bargains it demanded. All it could do was illuminate the choice, make visible the cost of cooperation, and offer Boone a moment of clarity before the machinery fully claimed him. Boone, hearing the warning, understood it intellectually, but couldn't act on it emotionally. He was too invested in the path he had chosen, too committed to the belief that his way was safer, smarter, more sustainable. So he thanked Elvis, walked away from that hallway, and spent the next 70 years discovering that safety and surrender were often the same thing. Elvis, for his part, never expected Boone to change course. He had simply done what he could, offered the warning, and then returned to his own impossible negotiations with fame. Both men, in the end, were consumed. The only difference was the speed and the spectacle. The aftermath of truth. When Boone's statement went public on March 28, 2026, the response was immediate but not in the ways anyone expected. There were no screaming headlines, no breathless cable news debates, no viral social media storms. Instead, the confession settled quietly into the cultural consciousness, resonating most deeply with those who understood its implications. Artists who had made similar bargains, industry veterans who had watched the machinery operate for decades, anyone who had ever traded authenticity for security and wondered if the exchange had been worth it. The entertainment press treated the revelation with unusual respect, sensing that this wasn't gossip or scandal, but something closer to testimony. A 90-year-old man finally unburdening himself of a truth that had shaped his entire life. Younger artists, particularly those navigating the new economics of streaming and social media, found unexpected relevance in Elvis's warning, recognizing that the fundamental dynamics hadn't changed, only the technologies and the speed of consumption. Boone himself retreated from public view immediately after the statement's release, declining interviews, refusing to elaborate, letting the words stand on their own. Those close to him reported a visible shift, a lightness that hadn't been present before, as if the act of finally speaking had released something that had been pressing down on him for decades. He didn't regret the confession, didn't second-guess the decision to break his silence. If anything, he seemed quietly surprised that he had waited so long, that he had carried the weight of Elvis's warning through so many years when releasing it had been so simple. But the relief was complicated by a deeper recognition that speaking the truth didn't undo the past, didn't restore what had been lost, didn't change the fundamental bargain he had made back in 1957 when he chose safety over authenticity. The statement also prompted a broader cultural reckoning with Elvis's legacy, a recognition that beneath the spectacle and the tragedy and the endless mythologizing, there had been a perceptiveness, a clarity about the nature of fame and its costs that had often been overlooked. Elvis hadn't just been consumed by the industry, he had understood the consumption even as it was happening, had tried to warn others. Odd had seen the machinery clearly enough to articulate its mechanisms. That understanding didn't save him, couldn't save him, but it mattered nonetheless. And Boone, by finally sharing the warning, had given Elvis's insight a second life, allowed it to resonate beyond the tragedy of his death, transformed it from a private moment into a public truth. The warning couldn't change what had already happened, but it might, Boone hoped, illuminate the choices still being made by artists navigating the same impossible terrain. The weight finally lifted. At 90, Pat Boone has come to understand that Elvis's warning wasn't a prophecy to be avoided, but a truth to be recognized, a clear-eyed assessment of the bargains fame demands and the costs those bargains extract. For 70 years, Boone carried the weight of that warning, and wrestling with its implications, trying to decide if Elvis had been right, if the path Boone had chosen had been worth the price. The answer, he now knows, is complicated. He survived where Elvis didn't. He built a long career, raised a family, outlasted the chaos that consumed so many of his generation. But survival came at a cost that took decades to fully calculate. The slow erosion of autonomy, the gradual disappearance of the artist beneath the image, the quiet surrender of self that accompanies every compromise with the machinery of fame. Elvis had seen that cost clearly, had named it plainly, and had tried to give Boone a choice. Boone made his choice, lived with its consequences, and now, finally, has spoken its truth. The confession changes nothing about the past, doesn't restore what was lost, or doesn't undo the bargains made in those long ago years when rock and roll was young and the future seemed infinite. But it does offer something else, a clarity, a recognition, a final honoring of the man who saw the truth and spoke it even when he knew it wouldn't change anything. Elvis passed away at 42, consumed by the fame he revolutionized. Boone lived to 90, outlasting the industry that shaped him. And in the end, both men paid their costs, just in different currencies at different speeds. The warning Elvis gave that night in Memphis wasn't a way to escape the machinery. It was a way to see it clearly, to understand the bargain before signing it, to know what would be demanded and what would be lost. Boone heard the warning, made his choice. Owen spent 70 years discovering that Elvis had been right about everything except one thing. That understanding the cost doesn't make it easier to bear. Now, in the quiet of his 10th decade, Boone has released the warning into the world, not as testimony. The weight he carried for so long has finally lifted, not because the truth has changed, but because it no longer belongs to him alone.